Welcome to the summer of 2025. The United States finds itself at a complex and challenging crossroads, a point where decades of policy decisions are converging with a rapidly changing global landscape. The core issues are not new, but their intensity and interconnectedness have reached a critical level. America's economic engine, once the undisputed powerhouse of the world, is showing clear signs of strain. The nation is grappling with a trio of formidable challenges: a weakening U.S. dollar, a mountain of national debt that grows larger by the day, and a palpable shift in its global influence. These are not abstract economic theories. They are shaping the daily lives of Americans and the strategic calculations of nations around the world, forcing a national reckoning. The story of mid-2025 is one of consequence. The persistent specter of stagflation, that dreaded combination of stagnant economic growth and stubbornly high inflation, hovers over the country. The first quarter of this year saw the economy contract by a concerning 0.5%, a stark warning sign. At the same time, inflation, while lower than its recent peaks, remains a persistent worry, fueled in part by new and aggressive trade tariffs. This difficult environment has created a deep policy divide, pitting a White House desperate for growth against a Federal Reserve wary of reigniting inflation. This internal conflict only adds to the sense of uncertainty that pervades both domestic markets and international relations, making clear and steady policy difficult to achieve. This domestic unease is mirrored by a profound shift in America's standing in the world. The U.S. dollar, the bedrock of global finance for nearly a century, is losing its luster. Competing powers, led by the BRICS nations, are actively building alternative systems for trade and finance, a process known as de-dollarization. This isn't just about economic competition, it's a geopolitical statement. As countries like China and India rise, they are challenging the post-World War II order that America built and led. The decline in the dollar's dominance is both a symptom and a cause of this broader rebalancing of global power, a trend that impacts everything from trade routes to military alliances. For the average citizen and the savvy investor, this new reality demands attention and understanding. The weakening dollar may feel distant, but it directly influences the price of imported goods, the value of retirement accounts, and the cost of a family vacation abroad. The national debt, now exceeding a staggering $37 trillion, isn't just a number on a government ledger. It translates into higher interest rates for mortgages and business loans, and it raises difficult questions about who will ultimately pay the bill. Navigating this maze requires a clear-eyed view of the challenges, an appreciation for the interconnected forces at play, and a strategy for what lies ahead in this uncertain new chapter of the American story. The U.S. dollar has been the world's undisputed king for generations, the currency of choice for international trade, central bank reserves, and global finance. But in 2025, that crown is beginning to slip. The U.S. dollar index, a measure of its strength against other major currencies, has been on a downward trend. This decline is not a sudden event, but the result of several powerful forces gathering steam. Domestically, uncertainty is a primary driver. The administration's aggressive and often unpredictable trade policies, including sweeping new tariffs on allies and rivals alike, have made international investors nervous. They question the stability and reliability of the U.S. as the anchor of the global economic system, causing them to look for safer havens for their capital. This trend is particularly evident when looking at the dollar's performance against the Indian rupee. The rupee has shown remarkable strength, a reflection of India's surging economy and its growing geopolitical clout. While the U.S. economy shows signs of slowing down, India is projected to be one of the world's fastest-growing major economies. This economic dynamism, combined with a stable government and a massive consumer market, makes India an increasingly attractive destination for foreign investment. As global capital flows from a slowing U.S. to a booming India, it naturally bids up the value of the rupee relative to the dollar, a clear signal of the shifting economic balance of power. Beyond bilateral currency movements, a more profound structural shift is underway: de-dollarization. For years, nations have grown wary of America's ability to weaponize the dollar through sanctions, freezing countries out of the global financial system. This has prompted a concerted effort, especially among the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, to reduce their dependence on the greenback. They are increasingly conducting trade in their own local currencies. For instance, over 90% of trade between Russia and China is now settled in rubles and yuan. This is a direct challenge to the dollar's supremacy, creating parallel systems that operate outside of U.S. influence. The BRICS bloc is not just trading in local currencies, it is actively developing the infrastructure for a post-dollar world. Initiatives like the BRICS Bridge, a proposed blockchain-based payment system, aim to create a fast, cheap, and politically independent alternative to the US-controlled SWIFT network. Central banks around the world are also diversifying their reserves, selling off US Treasury bonds and buying gold at a record pace. Each of these actions, taken individually, is a small chip away at the dollar's dominance. But taken together, they represent a systemic and accelerating trend that is fundamentally reshaping the architecture of global finance and challenging a key pillar of American power. A weakening US dollar is not just a concern for international bankers. It has a direct and powerful impact on the investments held by ordinary people. When the value of the dollar falls, assets priced in dollars become cheaper for foreign investors, often driving up their prices. We are seeing this play out across multiple markets in 2025. Consider the S&P 500. Even as the domestic economy shows signs of weakness, the stock market has demonstrated surprising resilience. Part of this is fueled by international buyers who see U.S. stocks as a bargain in their stronger local currencies. This influx of foreign capital helps to prop up market valuations, creating a disconnect between Wall Street's performance and Main Street's economic reality. The effect is even more pronounced in the world of cryptocurrencies. Assets like Bitcoin have been on a significant rally. These digital currencies are often seen as a hedge against the debasement of traditional fiat currencies. As the Federal Reserve grapples with massive government debt and the dollar's purchasing power slowly erodes, some investors are moving their money into assets that are outside the control of any single government or central bank. The narrative of Bitcoin as digital gold has gained significant traction. Its limited supply and decentralized nature make it an attractive alternative for those who have lost faith in the long-term stability of the dollar and the policies that govern it. Gold, the traditional safe haven asset, has also experienced a surge in demand. For centuries, investors and central banks have turned to gold during times of economic uncertainty and currency devaluation. This time is no different. The same fears driving investors to Bitcoin are pushing others toward the timeless security of physical gold. Central banks, particularly those in the BRICS nations and the broader global south, have been accumulating gold reserves at an accelerated pace. This is a strategic move to diversify away from the dollar and insulate their economies from U.S. financial policy. This institutional demand, coupled with retail investor interest, has sent gold prices to new highs. Finally, real estate has also been affected by the dollar's decline. Tangible assets like property are often viewed as a reliable store of value during inflationary periods. While high domestic interest rates have made mortgages more expensive for American buyers, the U.S. property market remains attractive to international investors holding stronger currencies. They are able to purchase American homes and commercial buildings at a relative discount. This foreign demand adds another layer of complexity to the housing market, contributing to price stability in some areas, even as domestic affordability becomes a growing crisis for many American families. The weakening dollar, therefore, creates winners and losers across the entire asset landscape. At the center of the fiscal debate in Washington is a piece of legislation with a characteristically bold name, the One Big Beautiful Bill. This sweeping proposal, recently passed by the House of Representatives, represents a major gamble on the future of the U.S. economy. Its primary goal is to stimulate economic growth through a series of aggressive tax cuts. The bill's centerpiece is a permanent extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which would lower tax rates for corporations and many individuals. Proponents, including the White House, argue that this will unleash a new wave of private investment, create jobs, and ultimately grow the economy so quickly that it will outpace the growth of the national debt. Advocates of the bill paint a rosy picture of its potential effects. They claim that by leaving more money in the hands of businesses and consumers, the legislation will spur innovation and increase productivity. The administration's official forecast suggests that the resulting economic boom will actually lower the nation's debt-to-GDP ratio over the long term. despite the initial reduction in tax revenue. The bill also includes new provisions aimed at reshoring American industries and penalizing corporate offshoring. One controversial measure is a new tax on foreign money transfers, which supporters say will encourage capital to stay within the U.S. borders and help fund the government. However, critics view the legislation with deep alarm, seeing it not as a path to prosperity, but as a fiscally reckless move that will pour gasoline on the nation's debt fire. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office has released a starkly different analysis. According to the CBO, the bill would add an estimated $2.4 trillion to the national deficit over the next decade. Economists worry that at a time when the national debt has already surpassed $37 trillion, the country simply cannot afford such a massive unfunded tax cut. They argue it will lead to what is known as crowding out, where massive government borrowing soaks up available capital, driving up interest rates and making it harder for private businesses to invest. Furthermore, many experts are skeptical of the bill's more protectionist elements. They warn that the proposed tax on foreign money transfers could backfire spectacularly. Rather than keeping capital in the U.S., such a tax could accelerate the de-dollarization trend that is already underway. It would give foreign governments and corporations yet another reason to seek out alternatives to the dollar for international transactions, further eroding its global standing. Critics argue that instead of a beautiful bill, this is a short-sighted policy that prioritizes short-term political gains over long-term fiscal stability and risks undermining America's already precarious economic position on the world stage. The U.S. economy in mid-2025 is, well, caught in a difficult and frustrating trap. The data paints a picture of stagflation, a term that honestly sends a shiver down the spine of any economist. On one hand, economic growth has stalled. The first quarter of the year saw GDP shrink by 0.5%, and while forecasters expect a modest rebound, the full-year growth projection of around 1.4% is sluggish at best. This slowdown is being driven by several factors, including a sharp drop in consumer spending growth and weakening business investment as confidence wanes. The labor market, long a bright spot, is also softening, with the unemployment rate ticking up to 4.1% and job creation slowing significantly, signaling a loss of economic momentum. On the other hand, inflation remains a persistent problem. While the headline CPI has cooled to 2.4%, it is proving sticky, and new trade policies threaten to push it higher again. The administration's broad tariffs, averaging around 15% on many goods, directly increase the cost of imports for both consumers and businesses. This feeds directly into higher prices on store shelves and in supply chains. Core inflation, which excludes volatile food and energy prices, is forecast to rise back above 3% by the end of the year. This combination of no growth and rising prices creates a painful squeeze for American households, as their wages fail to keep up with the increasing cost of living. This stagflationary environment creates an almost impossible dilemma for policymakers, leading to a significant and public conflict between the Federal Reserve and the White House. The president, focused on the slowing economy and an upcoming election cycle, has been openly calling for the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates aggressively to stimulate growth. However, the Fed, led by its independent board, is primarily focused on its mandate to control inflation. They see the rising price pressures from tariffs and are, understandably, hesitant to cut rates too soon, fearing it would unleash another wave of inflation. This has led to a tense standoff, with the Fed pausing rate cuts for 4 consecutive meetings, undermining investor confidence. The consequences of this policy gridlock are magnified by the country's massive national debt. With the debt now at $37 trillion, the cost of servicing it has become a huge line item in the federal budget. Annual interest payments alone now cost the government over $776 billion, consuming 16% of all federal spending. This is money that, frankly, cannot be spent on infrastructure, education, or defense. Furthermore, high debt levels force the government to constantly issue new bonds, competing with the private sector for capital and keeping upward pressure on interest rates for everyone. This dynamic limits the Fed's ability to maneuver and ensures that the specter of stagflation will continue to haunt the American economy. America's economic challenges are not happening in a vacuum. They are unfolding alongside a dramatic reordering of the geopolitical landscape. The nation's soft power, its ability to influence others through culture, political values and foreign policy, is visibly eroding. For decades, the United States was seen by many as a beacon of democracy and stability. However, recent years of political polarization, combined with an America-first approach to foreign policy, have tarnished that image. The 2025 Democracy Perception Index delivered a sobering verdict. A majority of the world's nations, 55% of those surveyed, now hold a negative view of the United States. This decline in favorability makes it much harder for Washington to build coalitions and lead on global issues. This waning influence is happening just as the rivalry with China intensifies, creating what many are calling a new economic iron curtain. The world is fragmenting into two competing spheres of influence, one aligned with Washington and the other with Beijing. Both superpowers are prioritizing strategic dominance over global cooperation, particularly in key areas like technology, trade, and finance. While the United States focuses on containing China's rise through tariffs and technology restrictions, China is successfully courting allies, especially in the global south. Beijing's message of economic development without political strings attached is finding a receptive audience in nations that feel ignored or lectured by the West, further chipping away at American leadership. The most potent symbol of this shifting world order is the global movement toward de-dollarization. The dollar's dominance has long been a cornerstone of American power, giving it unparalleled leverage over the global financial system. But this dominance is now under direct assault. The BRICS nations are at the forefront of this push, creating alternative payment systems and promoting the use of local currencies to bypass the United States' financial infrastructure. This is not merely a technical adjustment. It is a strategic imperative for countries that wish to be immune from United States sanctions. As more trade is conducted outside the dollar system, America's ability to influence global events through economic means will inevitably diminish. This new multipolar world is far more complex and unpredictable than the one America dominated for the past several decades. The United States can no longer assume that its priorities will be the world's priorities. It must now compete for influence in a crowded field of rising powers. The decline of its soft power, the strategic challenge from China, and the erosion of the dollar's central role are all interconnected facets of the same trend. America is transitioning from being the undisputed global hegemon to being one of several major poles in a world where power is more diffuse, contested, and fluid than ever before. The challenges facing the United States in 2025 are not separate problems. They are part of a dangerous and self-reinforcing feedback loop. At the heart of this cycle is the nation's soaring national debt. As the government spends more than it takes in, it must issue trillions of dollars in bonds to cover the difference. This massive supply of debt puts downward pressure on the United States dollar. International investors, seeing the ever-increasing supply of dollars and questioning the long-term fiscal health of the United States, become less willing to hold American assets without demanding higher returns or diversifying into other currencies. This contributes directly to the dollar's gradual decline on the world stage. A weaker dollar, in turn, fuels domestic inflation. When the dollar loses value, the cost of importing goods from other countries rises. Everything from electronics made in Asia to cars assembled in Europe becomes more expensive for American consumers and businesses. This imported inflation adds to the price pressures already present in the economy, making the Federal Reserve's job of maintaining price stability much more difficult. The Fed is then forced to consider keeping interest rates higher for longer to combat this inflation, which has the unfortunate side effect of slowing down economic growth and increasing the government's own borrowing costs, thus making the national debt even worse. This toxic economic mix has profound geopolitical consequences. America's declining fiscal and monetary credibility weakens its hand in global diplomacy. When United States leaders lecture other nations on fiscal responsibility, their words ring hollow against the backdrop of a $37 trillion national debt. Furthermore, the perception of American economic instability encourages other countries to accelerate their move away from the dollar. Nations like China and Russia seize upon this narrative, promoting their own currencies and financial systems as more stable and reliable alternatives. This erosion of the dollar's dominance is not just an economic loss, it is a direct loss of geopolitical leverage for the United States. The cycle then feeds back on itself. As America's global influence wanes and alternative financial systems gain traction, demand for the United States dollar and United States Treasury bonds decreases further. This makes it even harder and more expensive for the United States to finance its deficits, forcing it to either cut spending, raise taxes, or print more money, all of which have significant political and economic costs. This vicious cycle, where fiscal irresponsibility leads to a weaker currency, which leads to inflation, which leads to geopolitical decline, which in turn exacerbates the original debt problem, is the central dynamic threatening American prosperity and power in the years to come. For ordinary citizens and investors, the complex economic and geopolitical shifts of 2025 create a challenging environment. The old rules of investing seem less reliable, and navigating the path forward requires a new level of awareness and strategic thinking. The primary risk is the erosion of purchasing power. With stagflation taking hold and the dollar weakening, simply holding cash or low-yielding government bonds means losing money in real terms over time. Every dollar saved buys less and less, making it imperative for individuals to find assets that can either grow faster than inflation or hold their value in a different way. This is no longer a theoretical concern, but a practical reality for anyone planning for retirement or trying to preserve wealth. In this environment, diversification has become more critical than ever. However, the nature of diversification itself is changing. It's no longer enough to simply hold a mix of United States stocks and bonds. Prudent investors are now looking beyond American borders for opportunities. The relative strength of economies like India, for example, makes their stock markets, such as the Nifty 50 index, an attractive option for growth. Investing in international companies provides a hedge against a declining dollar, as returns in stronger foreign currencies translate into more dollars back home. This global approach helps to insulate a portfolio from risks that are concentrated solely within the United States economy. Beyond geographic diversification, investors are also increasingly turning to hard assets and alternative investments. As discussed, gold has historically been a reliable store of value during times of currency debasement and geopolitical turmoil. Its recent price surge reflects a flight to safety. Similarly, real estate as a tangible asset can provide a hedge against inflation. For those with a higher risk tolerance, cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin represent a more modern, digital alternative to gold. While volatile, they operate outside the traditional financial system, offering a potential sanctuary from the policies of central banks and the fiscal decisions of governments. These assets are no longer on the fringe. They are becoming core components of a resilient investment strategy. Ultimately, the best advice for the average person is to stay informed and avoid panic. The economic landscape is shifting, not collapsing overnight. Making rash decisions based on fear is rarely a winning strategy. Instead, a measured approach is needed. This means reevaluating long-term financial goals, ensuring one's portfolio is genuinely diversified across asset classes and geographies, and focusing on owning quality assets that can weather economic storms. It means understanding that the value of the dollar in your pocket is connected to the national debt in Washington and the rise of new powers across the globe. In this new era, financial literacy is not just a tool for wealth creation. It is a tool for economic survival. As the United States stands at this 2025 crossroads, its future trajectory is not yet set in stone. The policy choices made in the coming months and years will likely guide the nation down one of three distinct paths. The first, and most optimistic, is the path of adaptation. This scenario would require a rare moment of political courage and bipartisan consensus. It would involve making difficult but necessary choices to address the root causes of the current malaise. This would mean implementing a credible, long-term plan to control the national debt, combining sensible spending reforms with fair tax policies. It would also involve a strategic pivot in foreign policy, moving from unilateralism to rebuilding alliances and engaging constructively with the new realities of a multipolar world. On this path, America would focus on its core strengths: innovation, higher education, and the rule of law. By investing in technology, clean energy, and modern infrastructure, the United States could spark a new wave of productivity growth. A more stable fiscal policy would restore confidence in the dollar, slowing the de-dollarization trend and preserving its role as the world's primary reserve currency, albeit in a more balanced global system. This path of adaptation would not be easy and would require short-term sacrifices. However, it offers the promise of a revitalized economy and a sustainable leadership role for the United States in the 21st century, securing its prosperity for generations to come. The second possible future is the path of stagnation, which is arguably the one America is currently on. This is the path of political gridlock and muddling through. In this scenario, policymakers fail to address the fundamental issues of debt and declining competitiveness. The political divide remains too wide to pass any meaningful fiscal reforms. The conflict between the White House and the Federal Reserve continues, creating policy uncertainty and undermining economic confidence. The United States would continue to experience slow growth, persistent inflation, and a gradual erosion of its global standing. The dollar would continue its slow decline, and the national debt would continue to grow, but without triggering an immediate, full-blown crisis. This path of stagnation would feel like a managed decline. The standard of living for many Americans would slowly deteriorate as inflation outpaces wage growth. The nation's infrastructure would continue to crumble, and its technological edge would dull. America would remain a major power, but a diminished one, increasingly reactive rather than proactive on the world stage. It is a future defined not by a dramatic collapse, but by a frustrating and demoralizing inability to solve its most pressing problems. This is a future of lost potential, where America fails to rise to the challenges of a new era and instead settles for a less prosperous and less influential role in the world.